Welcome to Chatting with Casey with your host, Casey Palmer. 2019, live from 3.5, episode 3. Where are you from? Why Black Canadian isn't just one thing. Welcome to Chatting with Casey, the podcast that's all about family, food, fashion, and faith, and travel, and tech, and understanding that not all Black Canadians are Jamaican. In fact, some of them might be more Canadian than you are. Where are you from is a question for the ages that people of color across Canada know all too well. It's because where are you from is never answered with your city or your neighborhood. It's the country that your roots trace back to, even if you haven't been there for generations. Even if you're like me, a first-generation Canadian born in the heart of our country's sixth largest city, which is located right next to our country's largest city and larger than all the suburbs in the U.S., save Hempstead, New York. It doesn't matter. You are whatever your ethnic origins are, and Canada's not about to let you forget it. But I'm not Jamaican. Not really, anyway. Yes, I have the privilege of claiming it as my heritage, but I've only been there a couple of times. Old heads, the generation above us who actually grew up there and largely showed up in Canada once the Immigration Act passed in 1976. Many of them in my life have been quick to remind me that I'll never really get it because I was born here. So being more Jamaican than Jamaican, with a life more Robert Munch than Bob Marley, it's clear that for me, where are you from means something else entirely. And it'll continue to change. With more Black children born in this country every year, studies show we have one of the highest fertility rates across visible minorities. The assumption of how much we relate to our ethnic origins will need to change as well. The way I see it, it's only one way of looking at things. With heritage stemming from the largest group of Black Canadians by ethnic origin, much of the Black Canadian culture that non-Blacks know stems from what I knew around me growing up. Just check how much patois turns up in Cardinal Official's Bacardi slang or on Drake's If You're Reading This Is Too Late. To get a better idea of how the community see things, I needed to chat with someone who wasn't Jamaican, wasn't Torontonian, someone who'd see the story a little differently than I did. And so I brought Shirley Joseph on, a proud Haitian Canadian and the brains behind the Black Canadian Content Creators Facebook group, where I regularly discuss what it's like to be Black and a blogger in this country, both for better and for worse. We chatted on the dynamics of dealing with the question, the differences in how it's asked between Montreal and Toronto, and what we hope to learn from the experience. I hope you enjoy it. And welcome to another podcast for Live from the 3.5, talking about Black Canadian culture online and off. And I'm here with my guest, Shirley Joseph, who is the Grand Poobah CEO and the brains behind a group I'm part of called the Black Canadian Content Creators. And that's how we got in touch. Shirley, how are you today?
I'm very, very good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And how am I doing? I'm all right. 2 out of 4 of the Palmers are sick, but you know what? That comes with the territory.
I understand, Casey. It's all about being a parent. That's just part of the job.
Yeah, but they're also all asleep, so I'm really not losing out too much right now. It's working out okay for me.
Okay, good.
So, the topic we're talking about today is where you from? Why being Black Canadian isn't just one thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I've always it's always been presented to me growing up. Identity in my culture is very huge. I'm born and raised in Montreal. My parents are from Haiti, and being Haitian, our identity is a big deal. Because of the history behind it and what our ancestors have done in order for us to remain and still be here. So, being Black Canadian and Black Canadian Haitian, Canadian Haitian, is always, when I was younger, something that I was always, I wouldn't say struggling with, but more like just, it's funny because in Montreal, I find a lot of people asks you right away. And I think it's not a black thing. That's just the
Mm-hmm.
French Canadian culture. I don't know over there. Um, that they always ask you, where are you from? And it's like, but we always know, like, no, like, really, where are you from? you know?
Yeah. The not where you from, like in Montreal, where you from.
Right. But Italians do it to each other, the Jewish community, like everybody, everyone does it. It's a thing over there. And then moving here, when I moved to Toronto when I was a teenager, you don't hear that too much. It's not so,
Really?
yeah, it wasn't so blatant. Like
I heard it all the time. If I heard it more than I heard it growing up here in Toronto, I'd be scared because it happened often.
really, I felt like it
Hmm.
was like, it was the second or third question, at least the second question that
Oh,
comes up in Montreal. Like,
okay. I'll give you that.
yeah,
Yeah.
like here it's more like, hey, how are you? You know what I mean? How you doing? How's the weather? They loosen you up before they throw you so where are you from? Really?
Well, we're used to the Quebecois being pretty blunt. Like that's
Yeah,
just a thing
that it
we
is a thing.
recognize in Ontario, where we're like, all right, like they're about to get up in your face like day one for
Right.
a second.
It's like, hi, where are you from? Yeah. So, yeah, that's something um, that for me growing up was always, I guess I had a bit of an identity crisis when I was
Hmm.
younger, and I think it's just being, the spaces that I was in,
Okay.
especially going to, I'd say the first portion of my education all the way up to junior high being in private school.
Okay.
Status and identity was like this big thing, and especially with
Hmm.
being around all these rich kids. So, but then when I got into high school, I became a lot more at ease with my identity as a Black Canadian Haitian, really.
Well, that's fair. I mean, when I put the post around this podcast to talk about it a bit, one of the things, I guess, one of the lyrics that I point to often when it comes to talking about being Black Canadian is Cardinal Official's Bacardi slang
Mm-hmm.
from the early
Yeah.
2000s. Guyanese, Bayesian, and a whole heap of Haitian. And it just talks about the fact that, like, Black Canadian isn't just like one thing. And I've, you know, being confused as Ghanaian often, even though my parents are from Jamaica, but I'm born in the Toronto area. So really I'm Canadian, but I have Jamaican heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this multi-layered thing where it's like, how do you identify it now that my kids are like, half white, both parents born in Toronto area, but one's Jamaican and one's Dutch heritage. And I look at them and what their future is going to look like and where they identify. I'm just like, I'm sorry in advance because it's going to be a really, really interesting struggle for them to figure out who they are and how, they resonate and relate to
I can
things.
understand my kids as well. French Canadian and Haitian Canadian as well. So how do you communicate to your kids about? Is that a question that has come up with your kids about their identity or how you know who am I?
Yeah, well, they'll call out like, they're 5 and 3.
Oh, okay.
And they both already called me out as Black. I'm like, no, we know Daddy's Black.
Mm.
And in more recent days, they've started identifying Mommy as white. And we're like, okay. And then when I ask them what they are, and they're like, well, what are you? And he's like, I guess I'm Black. Kind of. Like I'm like, that's a fair answer. Like you'll need to piece together who you are. And my biggest thing that I constantly tell them is like, you are who you are. You're, this guy, you're this guy. And the labels and everything that everyone else throws at you, you can't ignore them, but you also can't let them define
Yeah,
you.
for sure. When my kids were younger, I didn't know how to answer that question because they started around 5 years old too. But I saw an interview with Lenny Kravitz a while back, and I really loved
Okay.
what his mother, because his mother is from uh, Bahamas, I believe. I think she's Bayesian background,
Okay.
and his father's Jewish. And I love what she said, and I took that and said that to my kids that you identify as who you want to identify. You are black and white.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality of who you are. But when you step out those doors in the society that we live in today, at this moment, you will be identified as black. And that's just the way that the world will see you for now. And hopefully, as you grow older, hopefully people continue to, and really explore and about identity, and the world will become better where they won't put you in that box anymore. But for now, that's the box that they'll put you in when you step out these doors. And that resonated with me with when she shared that with him. And I kind of passed that
Mm-hmm.
on to my kids as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense because the world is ever shifting and changing, and we, people talk about tolerance a lot, and it's not about being tolerated. It's about redefining the framework so that everyone has a space to fit in, no matter where they're from and how they identify themselves and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
But
And it's funny.
what I so
No,
go
I
ahead.
was gonna say it's funny
No,
because
I'm the host. You speak.
what's funny is just because I gravitated me about like being Canadian, Black Canadian is just not one thing. It's so true because when when we were podcasting with I used to podcast a show called Chonilla with my hubby.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of our listeners were Black Americans. And it was just, there was a lot of interesting things that they mentioned because they have such a lot more roots in America
Mm-hmm.
than compared to, a lot of us that are, Black Canadians. We're like usually by now first or second generation, you know, Black Canadians, unless you come from the ancestry of slaves who escaped and Underground Railroad and are in Nova Scotia and are like by now, third or like fourth or fifth generation. But there's always this sense of like identity. It's not something I guess at my end. I think that's the reason I was kind of lost and confused, because I didn't, when I was younger, identify myself as a Canadian, as a Black Canadian. I was more like, hey, I'm a Haitian, I'm Haitian, but I'm born in Canada. And it's not until, later as I grew older that I really identified myself as a Canadian Haitian, or as a Haitian Canadian. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
No, I agree with you though, but I hear you. It's like I don't think any of us early on identified as Canadian because so many of us came from immigrant parents who still had such strong roots to where they came from. So it just feel like, my parents had their Jamaican community, and because of that, Jamaican cuisine, Jamaican events, you went to go to a Jamaican hairdresser, things like that. You seek out the things that tie you back to where you came from. And it's only within the last few decades where we've really started to try and figure out what this idea of being Black Canadian is, regardless of where those roots are, because more and more kids are being born in Canada and they're slowly starting to move away from those roots. They're slowly, they are aware of where their parents came from, and they may be aware of the struggle and what it was like, quote unquote, back home. But now that they're here, what does that look like? What does it mean? And what kind of culture do they have to develop around?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I know for me, like growing up too, the confusing part is that as much as I was trying to figure out my identity, my parents who would also push the whole, don't forget don't forget your background and your heritage.
Mm-hmm.
But when I would do certain things or say certain things a certain way, they'd be like, oh, you're so Canadian. Did your parents ever do that?
Whenever I complain about the winter, my dad would remind me, he's like, well, you're born here. You should be used to this. So I'm like, yes, in July,
Right.
for one, which is like, up to like 40 degrees
Yeah.
sometimes. And for my American friends, that's like low hundreds for your
Yeah.
Fahrenheit scale. And then it'd be like, there's certain things where it's like it's kind of the same logic as when, there's two parents and they'll be like, oh, it's your kid who did this time, and you suddenly
Yeah.
disavow your ownership of that
Exactly.
child because it's something that is obviously from the other side of the family. It's the same thing where it's just like you're Jamaican until you do something
Yeah, that
so
they do not
abhorrent
agree
that would
with.
never do in
They're like,
Jamaica.
that's such a Canadian thing for you to do. You know, you don't
Uh,
understand. You're Canadian. It's like,
mhm.
what?
Yep. Oh, it popped up a lot in growing up. Now it's I feel it's kind of, I won't even say hilarious. It's a little
Yeah.
that hits me in the feels a bit because my dad, he originally wanted to go and retire in Jamaica when he was done working here. And after being gone 25 years, 26 years or so, he went back and realized it was nothing like the island he grew up on
Yeah.
living
Yeah.
on. And so I feel like he found himself lost in identity later on in life, where he's like in Canada, he's not necessarily Canadian. He knows he's Jamaican, but Jamaica's not the Jamaica he knew
Hmm.
anymore. And so I feel like that idea and the language that went around, like, you're so Canadian, really went to the wayside after he'd gone back and realized that who he was, or the idea of who he had as being in his head, was just kind of like this relic of the past and gone, because that Jamaica is no longer.
Wow. That is so interesting you say that because my mother went through this. My parents are retired. And for the past, I'd say 4 years or so, they spend their winter in Haiti. And so, like from
Hmm.
November, and they come back around April or so. And
Okay.
that was one thing because my mom uh, immigrated here, gosh, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. And so she hasn't been to Haiti for a long time until recently with her retirement. And that was one thing for her. It was big. She went through a culture shock, like, because it's not the same Haiti
For
that
sure.
she remembered. And people treat her like, in Haiti, there's such a, class. What's funny with Haiti's history too is class is not a color thing. It's really about, uh, it's not really about color, but it's about status more than anything. So for her, she's almost
Okay.
considered white because she comes from Canada, because,
Hmm.
they feel her coming from a much more well off, stable country, that they almost talk to her and treat her like she's white. And it's the weirdest thing. I remember her the first year where it was a shock for her. It was like, what? Even her
Yeah,
Creole
exactly.
is more French. It doesn't have. She's lost the patois aspect of Creole. So
Hmm.
they,
Hmm.
they they treat her and talk to her like almost like she's a white woman. And it's the strangest thing for her when she's over there. Yeah.
Wow. But that's what happens, right? Wherever you spend your most time is what shapes you, and what really starts to leave impressions on how you approach things and how you think,
Yeah, for
etc.
sure, for sure. So that's why when you encounter prejudices and racism outside of the black culture, it's the strangest thing because you know I guess for me that was one thing too growing up, is because I experienced that a lot growing up, especially going to these private
Hmm.
schools. So identity was very confusing for me, you know. Um, it was confusing because for me I was not accepted by the Haitian kids because I didn't speak Creole and I spoke more French.
Hmm.
Um, but meanwhile, the white
Hmm.
kids would not accept me. It's not. I mean, I laugh now, but then it was horrible. Like the white
Hmm.
kids wouldn't accept me because I'm black. It was very confusing time. And then when my parents, if I do something, would call me like, "Well, you're not quite Asian. You're not." They made me as a kid. I translated as "you're not quite black" whenever they would say, "Oh, that's very Canadian of you," and it's like, what? no, it's not.
Yeah.
I'm just as black as you are. And it was very confusing messages uh, in my youth.
Yep, there's another quote I have quotes for everything. And so there's another lyric from Childish Gambino from his Camp album, where I believe it goes, "Not black enough for the homies, but too black, no, not white enough to use your pool." And I'm just like, oh, that hits. It kind of hits you in a point where you're just like, you realize that even though you're on the search for acceptance or for belonging, it's a long journey for a lot of people. It's a decades long thing where you finally, it's like what I tell a lot of teenagers that I talk to when I'm mentoring them, that high school is not forever, and you'll get to a point past there where suddenly things make a lot of things that matter in high school don't matter in the real world, and you have other challenges that are far different than who's your best friend or your color your skin to a degree. Like, you'll come up with other challenges that do stem from these things, but it's in a different context.
How do you identify? Like, how do you when you're asked the question?
I'm a black kid who with Jamaican heritage, but really it's like I'm definitely have come to embrace being Black Canadian because that's who I've always been. Like, there's a lot of tokenism in my life as well, because I also did the private school route for a while, and lots of things where there would be almost no black faces around me. So I'm just so accustomed to being
I know
black
that
guy.
feeling. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was that girl too, the only black girl in the class, and it's like I felt this the tokenism thing and this pressure of like I got to represent my people, by the way I behave.
So become that safe advice. You know everything about all black people
right.
because you're the one.
And it's so funny because I think because of all these kind of confusion of identity in my youth. When I remember very clearly, I was just tired of that environment of private school and just all of it, right? So I remember telling myself, I'm going to go to high school and that's it. I was very clear into this is who I am. I'm not going to let anyone to tell me who I am anymore. And this is how I identify myself. And if they don't understand, it's not their problem. It's not my problem. It's their problem, So I was very, very clear of not allowing people to define me or try to label me in some way anymore. I was like, no, I'm not dealing with that anymore.
Ain't nobody got no time for that. So, where are you from is a loaded question. I think in our conversation here today, I think we've come to the conclusion that there really is like no true answer to that in a way. It's more that I guess we have to recognize that we all come from a myriad of different places, and that it's one of those things where you identify whoever you choose to identify as. We come from a culture that doesn't really have one set of rules or one central guidebook that says this is what it means to be black. So we just kind of have to define it as we go, and everyone has to have their own individual take on it.
Exactly. We are not a monolith.
I like it. All right. Well, Shirley, thank you for your time on this topic, and we'll get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a fun talk.
Awesome. Thanks all for listening, and please expect way more content for Black History Month. All right. Bye. So really, where are you from isn't that easy to answer. We know it's easy to want to lump us all together into one group if you're not from the community, but with almost half of us being Canadian-born and growing, you better get used to hearing Chateauguay or Pickering as often as you hear the name of another country. But that's it for this episode, and I hope you learned a little something. A huge shout out to Shirley Joseph for joining me to discuss the complicated narrative Black Canadians have with this country. And remember that we're just scratching the surface with a conversation like this. What are the obstacles to our success? Where do we hope to be in the future? What do we need to do more of for our own health? We'll be answering these questions and more in upcoming episodes, but till then, make sure to keep listening, keep your head up, and we'll see you for the next installment in the Live from the 3.5 series. We'll see you then.